What do we know about learning in the Middle Ages? That was the topic Canon Chris Pullin of the Hereford Cathedral Life and Learning Programme bowled at me as both a newly arrived retired bishop and as a medieval scholar with more time to put pen to paper than I'd had during my stipendiary career. This online lecture represents a version of a live one I prepared for the cathedral in response, which has had to be abandoned because of the COVID-19 restrictions. That doyen of medieval educational studies, Professor Nicholas Orme, has given us a good survey of what is known of the medieval schools of Herefordshire, first in a 1996 article in Nottingham Medieval Studies, and then in Aylmer and Tiller's 2000 volume on the history of the cathedral. This present lecture builds on his work and aims on the one hand to extend the breadth of the picture to include education before and beyond formal schooling, and on the other to draw attention to a number of manuscripts that provide important material evidence for that education, all drawing where I can on local sources, some of which are likely to be new to my listeners. I would like to start with a material object, in fact, the hornbook, a common medieval tool for teaching. Annoyingly, few medieval examples survive. But here on screen is a 14th century example in which the boy Christ himself is shown holding a hornbook, holding his mother's hand as she perhaps takes him to his teacher. Actual surviving examples are, as I said, extremely rare, but here is a later one of about 1625, which is typical of its kind. A printed text, earlier examples would have been in manuscript, of what we would call A5 size, is fastened under a transparent horn sheet to a wooden handled board. At the top are letters of the alphabet, first lowercase and then upper, preceded by a cross and followed by the vowels listed separately, and a number of digraphs, ab, eb, ib, etc. Then, in the name of the Father, and the Lord's Prayer, all in English here, but in Latin in earlier examples. The learner would have signed themselves with the cross and then read the criss-cross row, as it was called, sometimes saying the names of the letters, sometimes making their sounds, followed as their skill grew by the remaining material. In this way, the exercises represented by the board are teaching devotion as well as literacy. It's interesting to note that teachers and learners of the time were well able to distinguish between a letter's name and its sound, important in teaching reading. And a play from 1520 gives us a snatch of classroom phonics, not so different from what might be heard today as a word is sounded out. Lo, he hath forgotten, you may see, the first word of his ABC. Hark, fool, hark, I will teach thee. P, a, pa, t, e, r, ter, pater. Numbers would have been taught too, and an amusing illustration in a 15th century German manuscript shows a teacher holding up a larger version of the hornbook with numbers on it, with a caption which translated reads, "With calculus and numbers, I can be a star in arithmetic." This basic teaching could well have taken place in a domestic setting, and alongside it would come education in manners, as we might expect, which could be informal or in a form suitable for those being brought up in a more elevated household, such as the popular Latin poem Stans Puer ad Mensam, written in the early 13th century by Robert Grosseteste, who then or shortly before was serving on the Hereford diocesan staff, and whose significant educational role we will discuss later. Here is part of it in Nicholas Orme's translation. So, when you stand beside your master's table, behave while you are young by my advice and set your heart on learning to be nice. First, when you speak, be careful what you say, and do not fidget either by the way. Don't keep looking round, don't be engrossed in all the bustle of your master's hall. Don't slouch and lean your back against a post, or look as in a mirror at the wall. Picking your nose is nasty for us all. In Hereford, one motive for and consequence of a boy acquiring basic literacy was the opportunity to join the cathedral choir, for which a song school was in existence from Anglo-Saxon times until around 1300, the 13th century statute charging its master to find 5 pupils at any one time to sing the antiphons. As Orme reminds us, song at this time will be understood as including learning reading, as well as pronunciation and chanting as needed in the choir, and the school would have served others as well as would-be choristers. The cathedral also sponsored a grammar school to essentially teach the reading and writing of Latin, the existence of which is implied by the 13th century statutes, which require the chancellor to appoint a master of arts who must have been the schoolmaster. The boys of the choir would have attended, but the school was open to the public and indeed should to some extent be seen as a way of controlling that public education. Gerard of Wales wryly remarks in a letter to the then Chancellor Albinus of around 1208 to 1213 that the teaching of the school is open to all, annoying and good pupils alike. 13th and 14th century records place the school in School Street, later Old School Street, now the narrow lane that leads from the close to Harley Court, and the names of some of the masters are known. John Lellamore in 1373, Richard of Cornwall 1384, Thomas More 1396, and Richard Burgill 1492. Nothing, of course, remains of the School Street schoolroom, but manuscript illustrations and some survivals, such as that at Stratford-upon-Avon, give us some idea of the physicality of the school experience. A typical arrangement would have the master seated at the front of the room, usually shown occupying a fairly substantial and even grand seat, with an usher, an ostiarius or doorkeeper at the back. Between them, the pupils would occupy forms, the source of the later use of the term to designate classes, and as clerklings, as they might be called then, they would be gowned and perhaps tonsured. We've already mentioned the horn book that a younger child might carry to school. Once at grammar school, a boy might use a pair of folded together tablets, waxed inside, for note-taking in a format used since Roman times, with pen and parchment or paper after about 1400, as they learnt to not just read but write. A manuscript book written by a master at Magdalen College School, Oxford, in the dying years of the 15th century, includes a sentence to translate into Latin, which paints a picture of it for us. The last fair, my uncle on my father's side gave me a penner and an inkhorn, and my uncle of my mother's side gave me a penknife. Now, and I had a pair of tabils, I lacked nothing. In the upper form of grammar school, the pupil might eventually try his hand at a begging letter of his own for the items he needed. But on the way there will be much grammar to learn, enforced by beatings with the birch that was the recognised trademark of the master, who is seen holding one in nearly all contemporary illustrations, and the use of which was actually part of the graduation ceremony of a new Cambridge Master of Grammar in the 16th century, a boy being paid 4pence for the ordeal. Manuscripts have already figured in this account as important witnesses to life and learning medieval style, and my own doctoral research combed the fag ends of libraries across the country looking for those less than glamorous ones, often rather dismissively catalogued as notes or miscellanea, which contained surviving schoolroom texts and snippets, the Middle English treatises on grammar, of which there turned out to be some 30 or so, being my principal interest. And amongst these, Hereford is not without its witnesses. Sadly, the book most closely linked to the city, the volume once known as Jesus College Oxford MS 14, is now lost, but H.O. Cox described it in his catalogue of 1852 as a quarto volume of the 15th century, damaged at front and back, containing 1. A grammatical treatise by question and answer, beginning, How knowst thou the epicene gender? That's part of the Middle English treatise called The Accidents. 2. Grammatical questions and answers, beginning, Dominus quae pars, a very famous text. Third, grammatical rules in hexameters on preterites and supines. Fourth, a Latin-English vocabulary. And fifth, grammatical notes on heteroclite nouns. A note at the end of the book says, "This same is Roger Higgins, his book, being sometime clerk of St. Nicholas parish in Hereford." No Roger Higgins is found in the bishop's registers for the period, but if he was not the incumbent, he wouldn't necessarily feature there. And we can perhaps presume that he was an assistant, partly earning his keep by teaching. The Accidence would have been one of the very first texts used in what was emerging as a staged approach to teaching grammar, moving from elementary texts in English on the basic parts of speech and their endings, to text in Latin, such as the Dominus quae pars, to texts on more specialised topics, such as the one on heteroclite nouns, often accompanied by verses for memorisation. Within one short manuscript, we have a taster of all these. Happily, another manuscript with a strong Herefordshire, if not Hereford connection, does survive. Manuscript Dowse 103, with its twin manuscript Dowse 108, both in the Bodleian Library. Twins because matching wormholes on their outer leaves showed that they were once one, and the hand of 108 is also one of those in 103. Physically, they're again about A5 size, and a compilation of quires or booklets of paper of the 15th century, brought together by about 1492-4 by someone who writes this note in another manuscript, Dowse 60, which is also part of the group. Memorandum, how that William Hopkin of Pencoed oweth unto Sir John Davies for divers tithings and duties of the church 18 shillings and 8pence in pledge of 2 years, the 8th and 9th year of the reign of King Henry the 7th after the conquest. Sir here is the title given not to a knight, but to a lower cleric without a degree, the sort of priest who might have served the small community of Pencoed, which is off the Hereford-Ross road, which was attached to the larger parish of Sellac at that time. Such a curate, as we might call them, would not have their appointment listed in the bishop's register, but a John Davies is given there as ordained acolyte and subdeacon in 1490, and then deacon in 1491 to a title at Aikenbury Priory, which is only about 3 miles away, and this could well be our man. Dowse 108 is taken up with a copy of John Merck's Festial, a very popular work of the period, offering sermons in English for festivals through the year in a popular storytelling style, drawing on the Golden Legend, while MS 103 contains, amongst other items, a copy of Merck's Instructions for Parish Priests, which was similarly popular, this time offering simple instruction in English verse for parish clergy in doctrine and practice, covering such core topics as the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, the Creed, the 7 Sacraments, the 10 Commandments, the 7 Deadly Sins, the 7 Deeds of Mercy, and the 7 Virtues, all of which were evidently suitable as the basis for a cleric to instruct his flock. Taken together, the compilation is a practical toolkit for a new parish priest, and it reflects the increased attention given in the later Middle Ages to careful and informed preaching and pastoral practice, since, as the instructions themselves tell us, that when the blinder leadeth the blinder, into the ditch they fall and bore, for they nae sin whereby to go, so far emplaced is no by door, they baith blunder in God his law, that when they shall the papal leader into sin they do him leader. The material which the compiler adds to these core texts reflects Herefordshire strongly. We find a list of feasts to be celebrated at the Hereford Diocese, and rearrangements for easy understanding, and the expositions of their psalms and sequences, with added material covering St. Anne, the Visitation, St. Thomas of Hereford, St. Ethelbert, and hymns from the Hereford Use Breviary, all of local or contemporary interest. Alongside these, there is also material that our cleric could have used in teaching grammar to local children. In earlier hands, we find grammatical and explanatory comments on words from the Psalms, a treatise on quantities of vowels, and another on distinguishing similar words, but the compiler, reflecting perhaps his local needs, adds a text of the entry-level Middle English accidence, and in so doing perhaps gives us as well an early example of the local dialect. Here on screen is the beginning of the text with those spellings that could reflect a West Midland dialect marked in bold. How many teams been there? Fiith. Which fiith? The team that is no, the team that is not fully gone, and the team that is a gone, the team that more than a gone, and the team that is to come. How knowest the team that is no? For he betokeneth the team that is no as amo ilofa. How knowest an interjection? For he is a party of spake undeclined, the which sure to mon his will with an unperfect voice, as wonder, dread, or marvel. It is worth mentioning at this point that while another manuscript, Pennyarth MS 356b in the National Library of Wales, was compiled by one Thomas Pennant at Basingwark Abbey, we do find in it a further list of Hereford feasts, as well as another copy of the accidents, and it is just possible that there is a Hereford connection of some sort. Finally, in this group of manuscripts, one which survives in the Dean and Chapter archives at Hereford Cathedral as manuscript 3169 rather than in the main library collection, reflecting again perhaps the rather low status given to these sorts of books, does have a clear local connection, since it seems to have been in the archive at least since it was shipped off to London in the capsules during the interregnum. It's a 15th century book again, this time an excellent and scarce example of a single 12-page paper booklet still in its parchment cover, as might have been used by a student at Oxford, a likely place for its production. In it are notes to do with letter writing, and in particular something called transumptio, here meaning the art of varying expressions, and on circumlocution, both of these useful for rhetorical effect. Letter writing was often the work of jobbing clerks, and might be covered at the end of a grammar school course, or more likely in a specialised course, for which Oxford was a noted centre, in which a much more practical line was offered than in the rhetoric of the arts course proper. Most likely, whether reflecting tuition given at Oxford or more locally, it was a working notebook of a clerk whose duties involved letter writing in the orbit of the cathedral, but at the moment we cannot say more than that. Interestingly, the circumlocution text is a version of one by Simon Alcock, who amongst other things held a Hereford prebend earlier in the 15th century, but that may just be coincidence. Alongside the treatises for teaching grammar, exercises would of course have been used, very often taking the form of sentences to translate, known as Latinitates and Vulgaria. None of our Hereford manuscripts contain these, but one of around 1427 from not so far away Bristol, which reflects the teaching of Robert Lond, who was a schoolmaster there, includes an excellent collection. Some examples of his work from Nicholas Orme's useful collection of such exercises gives a flavour of them, and of how the pupil's interest was maintained by topical references, including here a reference to the Lollards, whose teaching Merck's work was partly written to refute. There booth mony Lollard is he tak in divers shares of this country, as he heard say now light of true men, multi Lollardi sunt capti in diversis comitatibus istius provinciae, proot ex relatione fide dignorum nuper accepi. He have dwelled at Bristol this 3 year, and as much more as from Michaelmas hitherto. Ego mansi Bristoli isto trienio et eo amplius quanto est lapsum festum Michaelis usque in hodierem deam. He can read to Bath in a day, and else for beyond for nid. Ego scio equitara Bathoniam in una die, et eo ultra pro necesse. A longer example from the Magdalen College School exercises can round off this section with a vivid picture of the schoolboy's day and its woes. The world waxeth worse every day, and all is turned upside down, contrary to the old guys. For all that was to me a pleasure when I was a child, from 30 years old to 10, for now I go upon the 12th year, while I was under my father and mother's keeping, be turned now to torments and pain. For then I was wont to lie still abed till it was 4th day, delighting myself in sleep and ease. There durst no man but he were made awake me out of my sleep upon his own head, while me list to sleep. My breakfast was brought to my bedside as oft as me list to call therefore, and so many times I was first fed ere I was clad. So I had many pleasures more besides this, whereof some be forgotten, some I do remember well, but I have no leisure to rehearse them now. For now the world runneth upon another wheel, for now at 5 of the clock by the moonlight I must go to my book and let sleep and sloth alone, and if our master hap to awake us, he bringeth a rod stead of a candle. Now I leave pleasures that I had some time, here is naught else preferred, but monishing and stripes. Breakfast that were sometimes brought at my bedding is driven out of country, and never shall come again. Grammar school was the summit, though, of many people's formal education. But in wider terms, it was a beginning, not an end, providing the Latin literacy that would be needed for further studies. We've referred to Oxford in this connection from time to time, the university physically closest to Hereford, and offering by the end of the Middle Ages a wide range of teaching in the arts and higher faculties, as well as in grammar and business studies. It's important to remember, though, that until the 13th century, England had no universities, and that as the 12th century Renaissance bloomed, it was largely cathedrals which were the seats of learning, as well as their bishops. A succession of bishops who had benefited from the emerging schools at Paris served the See of Hereford in the 12th century. Robert of Béthune, Gilbert Folliot, Robert of Melun and Robert Folliot all studied in Paris, and notable scholars held diocesan or cathedral positions during their careers, such as Walter Map, Gerald of Wales, and Robert Grosseteste. Much of the study at Hereford, as the books in the cathedral library demonstrate, was theologically focused, as one might expect, and in this earlier part of the Middle Ages, that meant especially concerned with Scripture and its exegesis. So Cathedral Manuscript 0612, for instance, is a 12th century psalter written in France but brought to and decorated in Hereford, in which the biblical text is glossed between the lines to explicate its meaning, and surrounded with notes to interpret it further. So on folio 63 verso, we have the text of Psalm 51 nicely laid out and incorporating a fine decorated capital Q, interlined with comments drawing out the meaning or moral, such as, in bono gloriandum, we should glory in the good, by the beginning of verse 3, why do you glory in malice? And with longer glosses in the margins, such as an explanation of why Jerome gives the name of Abimelech in Hebrew as Achimelech, because that was the name of this priest, but it varies because of the similarity of the letters Beth and Kaf. All these are what was by then traditional material, which circulated under the name of the Glossa Ordinaria. So this is a standard reference book, which would have found good use by preachers and students at the cathedral. Towards the end of the 12th century, concern about the low level of Christian knowledge among the clergy and indeed the laity led to the Third Lateran Council requiring in 1179 the cathedrals make provision for the education of the wider diocesan clergy, and this was taken up at Hereford. When Gerald of Wales wrote to Canon Chancellor Albinus in around 1213, he not only mentioned the grammar school, as we have noted, but referred to an auditorium that had been provided, that I take to be a lecture room in which further studies could take place. And the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 reenacted the 1179 decree on cathedral schools, ordering the establishment of lecturerships in theology, and also the appointment of preachers and penitentiaries to assist in giving sermons and hearing confession. Robert Grosseteste's work on the diocesan staff between 1196 and 1225 can be set against this backdrop, and his treatise De Modi Confitendi on the way of making confession, written at this time, is a severely practical work, which systematically analyses the origins of sins such as pride, how they manifest themselves and are identified, and the appropriate penances. Alongside such writing and accompanying or representing his seniors on visits, Grosseteste may well have also lectured on pastoral issues and on the liberal arts, with the education of the clergy in mind. When, however, Henry II banned English students in 1167 from studying in Paris, the early schools at Oxford began to gain momentum. Gerald of Wales chose it as a natural place to find an audience for his public reading of his Topographica Hibernica in 1188, and by 1201 a Master of the Schools, later Chancellor, was in place, a post held by Grosseteste himself, round about 1228 to 30, and the university was formally incorporated in 1231. Although this naturally eroded the position of cathedrals as the preeminent seats of learning, it is clear that Herefordians made good use of the new institution. We see the evidence of this not only in the recorded careers of clerics, but in the manuscripts they left their mark on there, often when they deposited them as security in a loan chest. The first of these chests was set up by Grosseteste in 1240. They soon grew to 20 in number and were a major source of finance on which students and even colleges could draw. One such manuscript was Cathedral MS P88, an early 14th century copy of Justinian on canon law used by Thomas Houghton, rector of Puddleston, who studied at Oxford in 1346, the manuscript itself coming to Hereford in the 15th century through the legacy of Owen Lloyd. Or manuscript O88, a mid-14th century Oxford copy of the dictionary called Catholicon, with loan cautions, as they were called, by Hereford students at Oriel College, including the well-known Wycliffite and later local and orthodox Canon of Nicholas Hereford, writing in their names when they left the book as a deposit against a loan. This book came to the library as the donation of another canon, John Bailey, in 1460 to 79. The studies at both Hereford and Oxford were shaped during this period by the 7 liberal arts, although this was more of a concept than a curriculum. The arts comprised the trivium, 3 ways, of language-based subjects, grammar, logic and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, 4 ways, of mathematically based subjects, arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. And Simon de Freyne, writing about 1195 to 7, a Herefordian, celebrated their pursuit at Hereford. The city of Hereford is greatly fitting for you, which is the proper place of the trivium and quadrivium. It has flourished and flourishes, and in this city, in a special way, the honour of the 7 arts predominates. It was in fact the quadrivial studies in particular that marked out Hereford and the southwest Midland region. Cathedral MS 089 of around 1200 mentions a Magister W. de Burger Geometria and a Magister Adolphus de Ucto Musicam. Scholars such as Alexander Neckham and Alfred of Surreshall, who translated or wrote on medicine, meteorology, plants and minerals, had connections with the city, absorbing new material from the Islamicate. And Roger of Hereford constructed astronomical tables set for its meridian in 1178, as well as composing a judicial astrology and computus, a treatise on the calendar using astronomy, for Bishop Gilbert Folliot, incorporating his name into an acrostic in it, as you can see in the image on screen. Gerald of Wales promised to send a map in his letter to the Hereford chapter to accompany his books on Wales. And of course, there is the Mappa Mundi itself. Completing this distinguished roll call of higher quadrivial studies in Hereford that preceded anything comparable at Oxford is the first phase of the scientific writings of Robert Grosseteste himself, who during his time there produced a series of groundbreaking short treatises on subjects such as the sphere of the heavens and the generation of sound, as well as a commentary on Aristotle's posterior analytics. Aristotle takes us to the summit of medieval studies and of our journey through education in Herefordshire in the Middle Ages. But before we finish, it is right to remember that although we've observed that education took place at some very different levels, there was nevertheless wrapped round it a large amount of less formal learning in vocational, domestic, military, ecclesiastical, legal and everyday skills that will have made up the larger part of formation for everyone from prince to ploughman. Nor was even the science without practical application. The computus was essential for compiling the church calendar and calculating the dates of the annual moving feasts that affected everyone, such as Easter. While we see Grosseteste's introduction to geometry in his treatise on the liberal arts, extended in its Middle English translation to give practical instruction in the use of the quadrant and the measurement of heights and distances, in much the same way as we see in Chaucer's treatise on the astrolabe. Hereford too, as a border arsenal, had a strong metalworking tradition, the key applied science of its day. And it is, of course, a tradition that continues to this day. From the National School of Blacksmithing at Hereford and Ludlow College, to the high-end alloy production at Special Metals Wigan Limited, to the birth of the new Model Institute for Technology and Engineering, all alongside the more general education of our schools, and of course the encouragement in life and learning still offered at our cathedral, and of which this lecture is part. This brings us to the end of our survey of life and learning in the Middle Ages, with special reference to the Herefordshire area. We've climbed the educational ladder from learning our letters and the art of song, through to grammar school and local further education for the clergy, hearing the sound of the classroom in local dialect and seeing the handwriting of local clergy as they ministered to and taught their flocks and learnt to take on useful administrative roles like letter writing. We've travelled with some of them to the new university at Oxford and back to Hereford with the manuscripts they gave to the library, and seen how the tradition of learning, especially in what we would now call science, was strong in the early Middle Ages and is still a feature of learning in the area today. To recap the words of Simon de Freyne, the city of Hereford is the proper place of the trivium and the quadrivium. It has flourished and flourishes, and in this city in a special way, the honour of the 7 arts predominates.